Hello. All right, we shall begin. Today I will be discussing with you the impact of colonial rule and how this uh, gradually led to the development of political consciousness in many societies around the Northeast region. So, uh, as we have seen, the British government, after they have captured and annexed most part of the Northeast region, they started following few basic policies towards the Northeast region as a whole. The first and foremost policy of the British was to contain the frontier tribes by continuing with the Ahom period's provisions, policies, of course, with certain changes, in the especially in issues like posa, cash payment instead of kind, as done by the Ahom. Another very important aspect, as we have seen, that was developed in terms of policies by the Britishers was with regard to how the East India Company government actually tried to entertain a friendly relationship with the tribes through various forms of political negotiation, treaties, and then of course laws that were passed in order to develop this relationship wherein the Britishers were only providing them paternal governance. However, any violation of these treaties by the tribes were considered by the Britishers as very serious, and force was being applied against such acts by the tribal groups. Another third approach that the British followed while governing the tribal region was that the government resorted to what was known then as the system of blockade, or the blockade system, by which the tribes were debarred from coming down to the plains to buy their necessary commodities from the market adjoining or the adjoining areas of the tribes. So therefore this led to a lot of issues and problems, and of course even conflict among a lot a matter of concern and discontentment by the tribal population, especially when they are met with such blockade. As you all know, the tribes depended heavily on the plains, especially for exchanging the goods that they produce with the goods that cannot be produced in the hill areas. So, in case of serious offense like murder or kidnapping of British subjects, very often the British would demand surrender of the culprits to the British authorities, and this was imposed through the negative political agent for trial of the offender. Uh, so therefore, sometimes expeditions were dispatched to arrest the offenders, whereby bypassing the authority of the tribal chiefs around the areas. So therefore, this was done by the Britishers to to secure their own captives, and this often, as we have seen, also led to a lot of confrontation between the Britishers and the rulers in different parts of the hill regions of Northeast India. There were also instances when evidences are not lacking, in which the whole tribes or the village or the whole village of the offender as a whole was being punished, which means the British engaged in a kind of raid of the whole village in order to capture the offender. So villages were punished, they were raided severely, and this was probably to impress upon the tribes and the villages of the consequences of the acts of few guilty. So through various fronted tribes, although various fronted tribes they tried, we have seen, like the Khasis, the Jaintias, the Garos, we have seen in the last class, although they tried to challenge the authority off and on, yet the British always overshadowed them because they had the power, they had the might with them. And their force was, of course, far more superior than any other forces that were available with these communities at that point of time. Another approach that was followed by the Britishers, or another policies that was followed by the Britishers, especially with regard to these frontier regions, was that the British government established few markets and organized fairs in the foothill areas, and we have seen this in areas like Sadia, Udalguri, Doimara. But these fairs were organized with the main motive behind trade fairs, but rather for the promotion and popularization of European goods. So British, while organizing these kind of fairs, although the supposed intention were usually for selling the produce of the tribes, yet they were more interested in popularizing and promoting their own European goods. So therefore, although the Britishers wanted to open stores to provide the necessity to the tribal population, this was often not successful, but rather this, in many ways, this created even more isolation, especially economic isolation of the tribal people. The fifth important approach of the British is that they followed a trade policy that led to the destruction of tribal industries, especially cottage industries, craft industries, iron industry, and so on and so forth. So what happened was the import of salt, influx of mill-made goods and yam and other machine-made goods, penetrated into the tribal areas, and the local productions slowly, slowly took a back foot, and slowly there was a tendency to develop a purchase of manufactured goods and tools that were being promoted by the Britishers and made either in the plains or those that were imported by the Britishers from their own colonies in other parts of the world or even in Europe. So this is the way in which the British gradually mechanized a situation where the tribal population, where the people of the region had to gradually depend on their market space, also on their products. Another important approach of the Britishers, as we have seen, or as we read in history, is that the British then started stressing on the consolidation, but no extension of the rule to the hills. They wanted to consolidate the hill areas, yet They were never concerned about the rule of law in this part or in the hill region. They tried to consolidate portion of the frontier territory and other parts of the hill region that were already in their possession, and to secure its good administration. But for this purpose, the government did not directly engage in the administrative affairs of these regions. They appointed agents, they appointed other people to take care, to deal with various tribes of that part of the hill region. We have seen this in many instances, whether it was in the case of the Garo Hills, whether it was in the case of the Lushai Hills, the Nagas, the system of Khatis in the Nagas, the system of Kakotis in the frontier tribes, the system of Maharis in the Garo Hills, and of course even in Jaintia Hills, where they destroyed the system of Doloiship and replaced that or rather they destroyed the system of aimship and replaced that by empowering the authority of the Dolois. So these are the kind of things that the British were engaged in, especially in trying to consolidate these areas. But as I mentioned, as I pointed out, rather not very seriously concerned about the administration. In addition, you see, the British government also established networks of intelligence services just after the Anglo-Burmese War of 1824 to 1826 in order to keep strict vigilance of the movement and the communication of tribes beyond the frontier region, particularly those situated near the Burmese frontier, and in order to gain through them information of all movements in Upper Burma. The British record indicate that they constantly, using various mechanisms, use the tribes in order to give them the necessary information that they wanted. This is the nature in which the British not only consolidated these areas, not only overpowered the administration of the chiefs in these areas, but rather they were also, despite all this, the functioning of their authority was in fact largely minimal. So, this is the nature of the British administration, in which over the period of time, the population of the hill region will certainly feel alienated, will certainly feel they are being segregated, and of course the most important thing is they would certainly feel isolated. Along with all this, in 1862 there was a person known as Henry Hopkinson. He was a commissioner of Assam, and after having experienced the nature of the relationship that the British had with the tribal population, particularly sometime reconciliatory relationship, sometime confrontational relationship. So he proposed to the government of Bengal at that point of time the ways and means to be adopted for administration of especially the northeast frontier tract. And Mr. Hopkinson, or Colonel Henry Hopkinson, he believed that the policy of conciliation with the hill people had failed, and therefore he wrote that, in his own words, that in restraining the savage tribes which infested our frontier, Reliance cannot be placed in one course of policy, but there must be a ready adaptation of expedients to suit every very varying circumstances that sometimes we might use coercion. Basically what he is trying to say is that after having seen the nature of relationship between the British and the tribal population, it is time to use coercion. He was more concerned. He seemed to have believed more on coercion rather than reconciliation. So he also wanted that the British must cease, to regard the tribes as aliens or even as enemies, instead acknowledge them as subjects. You see, that is the change. Earlier, the British regarded them as friends, regarded them as as a group of people that can be discussed, that can be dialogue, and so on and so forth. He said we should consider them as subjects. So this is the kind of conviction that he has. So, so therefore, as I said, number one, he held them that it is important to use them to use coercion or to use force. Second is to to use them as subjects, and no more as enemies, and so on and so forth. And most importantly, to seek to establish themselves, or the Britishers seeking as to establish themselves to the extent to extend their influence over the tribal population and to bring them under the control and within what he says the pale of civilization, which means he wanted the tribes to be brought under the British occupation, which means complete British occupation. So this is the nature of the change of approach by the Britishers towards the tribal population. So Colonel Hopkinson, he was considered as one of the first British officers who had the foresight to see that by annexing Assam, the British government accepted the obligation of administration of the northeast frontier tribes, and he criticized the government for creating a wall of separation between the hills and the plains in the provinces. So in a nutshell, what happened was the Hopkinson argued that the British to undertake various developmental projects for proper administration of the area. So he believed that the British should not rest, and he helped in Assam, he helped in Assam till all the administration of hills were provided for. So later he wrote in the report to the government of Bengal that in taking possession of the country, when he says country, he meant Assam. He said we also incurred a very distinct and positive obligation to administer, if to the best of our ability, and at any expense to also secure the most absolute protection to life and property of the people of the region. So we should have, he said that we should have separated the people of the plains from the people of the hills, should have made the former our subject while renounce the latter. So this is basically the you can see the nature of the British policies that was being followed in this particular region. So in fact, the government of India was convinced of the necessity to reorganize, the military force as suggested by Hopkinson, and accordingly, 2 battalions of military police were recruited from this region, who were posted along the inner line region. Of course, we have not discussed the creation of inner line here, but with this, there was the question of the outer line and the inner line. by this, the British had already, by 1874, the British had already brought in all these regulations. So, so therefore, we can see that, as indicated by various historians, that the beginning of political evolution, or the beginning of political consciousness uh, among the people started with the creation of the inner line regulation in 1873, especially in the northeast frontier tract, which was formulated to bring under more stringent control the commercial relationship of the British subjects with the frontier tribes. Which means although the British argued that this was the best way in which the tribes can be protected from the plain subjects, yet in many ways this was also the way in which the British actually used restraints from the influence of the hill tribes trade in the plains, in the plains. So therefore, it is also worth mentioning that the experience of the colonial rulers with the tribal in India had not been, certainly had not never been a pleasant one, and they had faced trouble, in different parts of the country while dealing with them. This was evident by various mutinies like that of the Singhbhum in 1831, Khon uprising in 1846, Santhal rebellion in 1885, and therefore the British declared these areas as non-regulation tract, and this was the way in which they also tried to approach the northeast region. Day before yesterday, we discussed about the declaration of scheduled districts, so which took place in 1874, and according to the constitutional and administrative growth of the present day Arunachal Pradesh, this led to the creation of the Scheduled District Act of 1874, by which districts like that of Kamrup, Darang, Nagaon, Sivsagar, Lakhimpur, Garo, Khasi, Jaintia Hills, Naga Hills, Kachar were declared as scheduled districts by this Act of 1974, which came about on the 1st of January, which was implemented and declared in the 1st January in 1875, which means on the first day of 1875. Through this declaration, Golpara and Sylhet were also made, almost as scheduled districts, and this arrangement had a basic aim behind it. That was to provide a simpler form of administration in the province of Assam. So, special rules for the administration of justice also was being part of this Scheduled District Act, whether it is civil matters or criminal matters, and this was provided in this particular act. So, as I said, British used many mechanisms to be able to build up a relationship with a tribal population, and one of this was basically because of the proposal by Hopkinson, and one of that, the outcome of that is the declaration of the scheduled district. So the problem of tribal administration also caught the attention of the British government of India after the occupation of Assam, that we all know. Therefore, the government wanted to provide a simple form of administration to those areas where the local tribal customs and conventions could be accommodated. This was the way in which the British did, and therefore this was primarily done in order to fit themselves into the setting of various tribal customary laws, customary practices, especially in dealing with various forms of dispute. So the idea of scheduled district came into being because of the fact that tribal had their own ways of administrating even before the arrival of the Britishers, and their customary laws, their customary practices are indeed very different from that of the plains. So therefore, in order to accommodate all these aspects of tribal population, the British came about with this particular Scheduled District Act. So therefore, by this act, what happened with this act? By this act, or by the implementation of this act, the Commissioner of Assam was authorized to extend the act to the frontier tract for peace and governance. The purpose of the Scheduled District Act was that the Commissioner of Assam, the Chief Commissioner of Assam, can look into the affairs of the customary practices of the tribes, and to extend this act to the frontier tract, which means to Nepha, to Arunachal, for the purpose of building peace and governance. So with the previous sanction of the Governor General in Council, the Chief Commissioner of Assam was authorized to engage with the frontier tract tribes, and this was the act that enabled him to do so. He could also extend to these areas any act, any act or part of passed by the legislatures of any provincial or central government, by notification in local gazette. Which means if any act that is passed by the central government or by the provincial government can be applied into these areas, provided he has analyzed and found that these acts are applicable to these areas. So just like the way in which the laws passed by the central government and the provincial government cannot be implemented in excluded areas and partially excluded areas. So this is a similar thing that happened. So under section 2 of the mentioned act, the Chief Commissioner had the power to propose to the Governor General in Council the draft of any regulation for peace and good governance of the frontier tribes, which means, which basically means that it is a different approach to these areas. So this is what the Government of India Act 1919 also did, and 1935 to this particular areas. And same thing is being continued till today through the various mechanism of the 6th schedule in the post-independence era. So, as I said, under section 2 of the mentioned act, the Chief Commissioner had the power to propose to the Governor General any draft for regulation of peace and good governance in this particular tract, which, when approved by the Governor General in Council, had the force of law after the notification in the local gazette, which means applicable only into those areas. So the same act also authorized, the Chief Commissioner under section 6 clause 3 to define what authority and jurisdiction, powers and duty of of the operation of any enactment, especially for the time being enforced in the frontier, and to be exercised and performed by the Chief Commissioner himself. So this is the regulation under the Scheduled District Act. In the meanwhile, the Inner Line Regulation, which was passed in 1873, and also through that particular regulation, the deputy commissioners were asked by the chief secretary to propose the inner line of the respective district, which means the deputy commissioner had asked the chief secretary of this region to see where this inner line regulation can be implemented and where it should not be implemented. So the deputy commissioner of Lakhimpur, Colonel Clark, while submitting his proposal with respect to his district, He stated that the frontier of his district was inhabited by tribesmen and would be inadvisable to administer as people in other parts of the district. So therefore the Chief Commissioner of Assam wrote to the government of India at that point of time for drafting a set of rules for the administration of justice in the frontier areas. So with the passing of two acts, the Scheduled District Act of 1874 and the Local Extent Act of 1874, it made clear now how and what part of British India different laws passed by the government where to operate and when and where not to operate. The Local Extent Act, this is an act known as the Local Extent Act 15, particularly specified the laws which were enforced in India in general, and except in certain backward tract described as the Scheduled District under the Scheduled District Act of 1874, and authorized the government to declare by notification in their gazette what laws were enforced in such district and to what extent to them any enactment enforced elsewhere which might seem desirable can be administered. So this is something new that the Britishers brought in order to ensure that the tribes were regulated differently. The next stage of administrative growth by the Britishers can be noticed in the form of the Assam Frontier Tract Regulation of 1880. This act, it provided for the removal of certain frontier tract in Assam inhabited or frequented by what was called by them as the barbarous or semi-civilized tribes from the region, and in operation of the operation of the enactment of the law under this provision. So basically, what we can see is that the Britishers had a very difficult. It was a very challenging aspect for the Britishers to govern this region. There was another important officer known as Sir Charles Eliot, who was the assistant political officer in the Sadia in 1882, and J.F. Needham, another British official, who both of them originally belonged to the Bengal police. They were appointed as the first political officer to regulate the political relationship of the British with the Adis, the Mishis, the Simpos in the hill tract region in 18 from that point in time until 1882 there was a relationship between the Britishers and the tribal population. Later these people, especially Needham, was succeeded by a person known as Noel William, and he also continued with the kind of approach in order to deal with the frontier tract tribes. Now, these are the ways in which the British deal with this situation. In 1912, the British also made a division of the frontier into 3 tracts. That is basically to ensure that they can administer this tract more closely. So the Naga Hills, the Lushai Hills, the Garo Hills, the Khasi and Jantia and the North Kachar Hills form 5 ordinary hill districts in the state, of which the northeastern border of Assam were put directly under the government of India to be administered by the governor of Assam. So the northeastern frontier land known as the NEFA came to be divided into 6 zones. The Kameng Frontier Agency, the Subansiri Frontier, agency, Siang Frontier, Lohit Frontier, Tirak Frontier, Tuensang Frontier, and so on and so forth. Then, of course, there are also other frontiers that were being looked upon by the British. So these are the ways in which the British actually tried to bring about change in the administration in this particular region. So, so therefore, what basically we can say here is that through this diverse means of administration by the Britishers in this hill tract region, we can say that that was the beginning of the time when the people started realizing that yes, we are different and we are also being recognized as different by the administration, which was at that point of time the Britishers. So in 1919 there was the Government of India Act, and as I said, the Government of India Act brought about a new approach to this region, wherein this region were divided into backward areas and partially backward areas. I'm not going to go into this detail because we will keep referring to this a little later. And towards the end, with the Montague-Chelmsford, reform under what is then known as the Simon Commission, these regions were considered as the excluded and partially excluded areas. So, moreover, you see, after the First World War, the spirit of humanism also spread in the world, and people started talking about human rights, protests against exploitation, and so on and so forth. So, the concept of mandate was developed for protecting the interests of the underdeveloped people under the supervision of the League of Nations. So, as part of this worldwide change of outlook, the protection of tribal rights also now caught the attention of the philanthropic people, or of people of various, across the globe. In India, British administration administrators, like J.P. Mill and J.H. Hutton, who served in the hills in the northeast, was struck by the exploitation of the simple tribal people by, not only by the Britishers or the administrators, but also by adventurers and businessmen whom they thought, if not actively patronized, was at least tolerated by the government of the day. So therefore, these people, and along with many others, started writing in journals to enlist popular support for stopping, such practices towards the tribal people. And the government also now adopted a more or less benevolent attitude towards the tribal people. And the government, and of course, the atmosphere of political tension between the rulers and the politically conscious section of the Indian nation led to the solitude, the government solitude towards the tribal welfare. They started thinking about tribal welfare, and this in any way was utilized more for segregating the tribal folks from the Indian community. They wanted, by patronizing the tribal population, they wanted to keep them away from the whole and movement for nationalism that was taking place in India. So this policy of segregation also gave shape to the first time the nature of reform in 1919, and therefore absorbing all these Scheduled District Act into a new, as I said, a new form of approaching this region in the form of excluded areas and partially excluded areas, and and then adopting the inner line regulation that was already in place from 1873. The Northeast Frontier Act of 1875. Then Edwin Montague Lord Chelmsford, under the direction of the House of the Commons, also prepared a report on the constitutional reform in India, and they also recommended restructuring of government of India, but towards the tribal population, the tribal issue was not given new complexion, but rather they only gave the recommendation for administrating these region separately. You know, so uh, uh, this is the way in which the British approached this particular region. And as I told you, later the Government of India Act 1935 came into being by the Statutory Commission, and this also in many ways churned a new political dimension for the tribal population. So with all these things happening side by side, we must also understand that the northeast population also gradually gained certain kind of political consciousness, whether it was through the process of all these laws being implemented, through their participation in the First World War as the Labour Corps, or through the emergence of printing press in this part, especially in the tribal region, because of the contribution